My late husband, Richard, was a man who believed in fail-safes. In his world of engineering and invention, every system had a backup, every circuit had a breaker, and every treasure had a secret security protocol. He built redundancies for his redundancies. He was a genius, a man who saw the world as a series of intricate systems, some elegant, some deeply flawed. Our marriage was the most elegant system he ever knew. His relationship with our son's wife, Ashley, was the most flawed. He knew it, and he planned accordingly. My name is Vivian Hayes. To my daughter-in-law, I am a fossil, a relic of an analog age, living out my quiet, silver-haired years in a house full of clutter. She sees me as a gentle, slightly naive old woman, someone to be managed and patronized. She has no idea that I was the one who helped Richard design the encryption algorithms for his first patent. She has no idea that this clutter is a fully integrated smart home of my own design. And she has no idea that the most precious piece of that clutter, my husband's final gift to me, is broadcasting its exact location to my desktop computer, right now. If you are listening to this, please consider subscribing. This is a story about the profound arrogance of the young and the quiet, calculating patience of the old. It's about a locket, a lie, and a lesson in underestimation that was 2 years in the making. It began, as these things often do, with a visit born of obligation rather than affection. Ashley, my daughter-in-law, graced my home with her presence on a Tuesday afternoon. She is a woman who documents her life rather than lives it, a self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer whose primary skill is applying flattering filters to her own profound emptiness. She swept into my living room, her phone already held aloft, recording a story for her followers. "Hey everyone," she chirped to her unseen audience, "just stopping by to check on my adorable vintage mother-in-law. It's so important to make time for family, right?" She panned the camera around my room, lingering on my collection of first-edition novels and the antique grandfather clock that had belonged to Richard's father. "Look at all this incredible history. It's like stepping into a museum." In her world, museum was a synonym for graveyard. "Hello, Ashley," I said, not looking up from the difficult Sudoku I was working on. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" She ended her recording, and her bright, public smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of bored impatience. "Just checking in, Vivian. Making sure you haven't forgotten to take your pills." She wandered around the room, picking up objects and putting them down with a critical air. "Honestly, I don't know how you live with all this stuff. It's so dated. We should really get a minimalist designer in here to modernize the space for you." "I find it comforting," I said, my voice calm. "Every object in this room has a story." "Stories don't pay for a new kitchen," she retorted, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on my solid oak coffee table. "Equity does. This house is a goldmine, and you're using it as a storage unit for memories." I simply smiled and continued with my puzzle. Arguing with Ashley was like playing chess with a pigeon. It knocks the pieces over, defecates on the board, and then struts around like it won anyway. Silence was my preferred strategy. My silence, however, only seemed to embolden her. She moved to the mantelpiece, where my most treasured possessions were kept, and her eyes, like a magpie's, landed on the one thing of true value in the room, the locket. It was a beautiful, heavy piece of 18th century gold, intricately carved with a design of 2 swans, their necks intertwined. It was the last gift Richard had given me, just a month before he passed. "Now this," she said, picking it up, her tone suddenly interested. "This looks expensive." "It is priceless," I said, and for the first time, a genuine emotion, a cold note of warning, entered my voice. "Put it down, Ashley." She held it up to the light, her eyes narrowed, assessing its weight, its carats. "Priceless is a sentimental word, Vivian. I'm talking about actual price. What do you think this would get at a pawn shop?" "I wouldn't know," I replied, my gaze fixed on her, "as I have no intention of ever finding out." She laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "You're so old-fashioned, holding on to things for sentimental value. Don't you know that memories don't pay the bills? This could fund my next trip to Bali." She dangled it for a moment longer then. With a theatrical sigh, she placed it back on the mantelpiece, though not before her thumb brushed against the clasp, testing its strength. She was probing for weakness, in the locket and in me. Later, as she was leaving, she asked if she could use my powder room. It was a strange request, as she had a perfectly good bathroom in the car she drove, but I just nodded. She was in there for an unusually long time. When she emerged, she was smiling, her purse clutched a little too tightly. "Thanks for the chat, Vivian," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "Do try to get out more. It's not healthy to be cooped up with all these ghosts." After she left, a profound, preternatural silence settled over the house. I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the marble in my foyer, what she had done. I did not rush to the mantelpiece. I did not need to. I already knew what I would find. Instead, I walked calmly to my study. I sat down in front of my custom-built, triple-monitor computer setup, the one hidden behind a sliding panel of antique books. I took a slow, deep breath, and I began the hunt. The locket was gone, of course. The empty space on the velvet cloth where it used to sit was a gaping wound. A few hours later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ashley. It was a picture of her, pouting, at a ridiculously expensive restaurant with a plate of oysters and a glass of champagne. The caption read, "Decided to treat myself. You only live once. Number YOLO. Number living my best life." Underneath, a second text arrived. "That worthless junk is better off as cash, don't you think? Just helping you modernize. XOXO. The cruelty was breathtaking. The taunt was undeniable. She wasn't just a thief, she was a sadist. She wanted me to know she had won. She wanted me to feel the pain of my loss. I looked at the text. I looked at her stupid, smiling face, and I felt nothing. No anger, no grief, only the cold, clean hum of a machine kicking into high gear. I had hoped, for my son's sake, that I would never have to use Richard's final gift. But Ashley, in her arrogance, had just entered the activation code. Most people believe that grief makes you soft. That loss hollows you out, leaving you fragile and exposed. They are wrong. True, profound grief does not soften you. It tempers you. It burns away the non-essential, the trivialities, the polite fictions. It leaves you with a core of pure, unadulterated steel. For 2 years, my grief for Richard had been a quiet, private forge. Ashley had no idea what kind of woman she had just decided to provoke. I did not reply to her text. Replying would be a sign of weakness, an admission of pain. It would feed the very validation she craved. Instead, I saved a screenshot of the message, complete with the date and timestamp, and archived it in a secure, encrypted folder on my server. The folder was labeled simply Evidence. Then, I turned my attention to the main event. In my study, behind a sliding panel of what appeared to be first edition copies of Proust, was not a bookshelf, but the glowing heart of my home's security system. Richard had designed it, a beautiful, silent web of sensors, cameras, and data processors that he had built as his final, secret project. He called it the Sentinel. He had told me it was to protect me from the outside world. I always knew he had built it to protect me from the inside. With a few keystrokes on my ergonomic keyboard, I brought up the main interface. I bypassed the standard home security protocols, the door sensors, the motion detectors, and went to a submenu marked with a single, elegant icon. 2 intertwined swans, the same design as the one on the locket. Richard had presented the locket to me a month before he passed. We were sitting on the veranda, watching the sunset. He was frail, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "It's beautiful, my love," I had said, admiring the exquisite 18th century craftsmanship. "It is," he'd replied. "But its true beauty is not in its age, but in its modernity." He had then shown me the secret. A tiny, almost invisible seam along the edge of the filigree. With a specific sequence of pressure, a small panel would open, revealing not a space for a photograph, but the gleaming, microscopic circuitry of a state-of-the-art GPS, GLONASS tracking unit, complete with its own kinetic power source. "It will charge itself with your movement," he had explained, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. "It will never run out of power, and its signal is encrypted with a key only you and I know. Think of it as A safety deposit box that you wear around your neck. A way for me to always know you're safe. I understood his true meaning. It wasn't about my safety from strangers. It was about the safety of his legacy, of our life's work, which he knew would one day be condensed into a single, vulnerable object, his widow. The locket was not just a sentimental gift. It was a failsafe. It was a weapon. Now, in the cool, quiet dark of my study, I entered the encryption key, the latitude and longitude of the little cafe in Paris where he had proposed to me. The system authenticated my identity, and the screen flickered to life. A satellite map of the city materialized, sprawling and complex. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, after a few seconds of satellite triangulation, a single, pulsing, ruby-red dot appeared on the map. It was in the heart of the downtown luxury district, right outside the restaurant from Ashley's taunting photograph. "Got you," I whispered to the empty room. The hunt had begun. For the next hour, I did not move. I just watched. I watched the red dot remain stationary at the restaurant for precisely 57 minutes, the average length of a self-congratulatory lunch. I watched as it then began to move again, a slow, predictable path through the city's most expensive shopping district. It stopped at Chanel. It stopped at Gucci. It stopped at a ridiculously overpriced boutique that sold nothing but designer handbags. She wasn't just stealing, she was liquidating her crime, converting a piece of history into a pile of disposable, modern status symbols. It was, in its own way, a perfect metaphor for her entire life philosophy. I zoomed in on the satellite view, cross-referencing the signal with the network of public traffic cameras I had access to. I watched her, a tiny, self-important figure in a white dress, striding down the sidewalk, weighed down with shopping bags. She was so confident, so utterly oblivious. But then, the red dot did something I had not anticipated. It moved away from the luxury district, heading east, toward a grittier, more industrial part of the city. A part of the city known for its pawn shops, its bail bondsmen, and its quiet back-alley transactions. It finally stopped at a small, unassuming building on a side street. I did a quick search. The sign on the door, according to Street View, read, "Honest Abe's Pawn and Loan." She had pawned it. After her little shopping spree, she had gotten rid of the evidence, converting the gold into a more liquid and less traceable form of currency. It was a smarter move than I had given her credit for. But then, the dot did something even more interesting. It began to move again, but this time, it was separating. The strong primary signal from the locket's main tracker remained stationary inside the pawn shop. But a second, much fainter signal, a low-power Bluetooth beacon Richard had built in as a backup, was moving away. It was heading back towards her house. My blood ran cold. I zoomed in on the image of Ashley walking away from the pawn shop. I saw it then. Around her neck, she was wearing a new necklace, a cheap, gold-plated replica of my locket. She hadn't just pawned the original. She had bought a fake to wear in its place, a piece of costume jewelry to maintain the illusion, to continue her deception. If I ever asked to see it, she would show me the replica, and I would be none the wiser. The sheer, calculated audacity of it was breathtaking. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. This was a cold, premeditated act of profound, personal betrayal. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating my face. The initial, cold satisfaction of the hunt was now being replaced by something else. A slow, burning, and utterly righteous anger. She had not just stolen from me. She had desecrated a sacred object. She had replaced a symbol of love and history with a cheap, hollow imitation. And she thought she had gotten away with it. She thought she had won. I looked at the pulsing red dot, safe and sound inside Honest Abe's pawn shop. The game was not over. In fact, it had not even truly begun. Richard had given me the tools. Now, it was up to me to build the trap. For the next 48 hours, I became a ghost in my own home, the silent, unseen operator of a one-woman intelligence agency. My world condensed to the cool blue glow of my monitors, the quiet click of my keyboard, and the steady, pulsing heartbeat of the red dot on my screen. The locket remained safe, tucked away in the back room of Honest Abe's Pawn and Loan. Ashley, meanwhile, continued her victory tour, posting a relentless stream of photos to her social media. New shoes, new dresses, lavish dinners, all captioned with sickeningly cheerful hashtags about being number blessed and number self-made. She was laundering my memories and calling it success. My first move was not one of aggression, but of verification. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I did a deep dive into Honest Abe, the pawnbroker. His name, I discovered, was Abe, a man with a minor criminal record and a reputation for buying valuable items with no questions asked, then quickly moving them through a network of discreet international buyers. He was not just a pawnbroker, he was a fence. This was good. It meant the locket, with its immense historical value, was likely still in his possession, waiting for the right, high-end, anonymous client. My second move was to understand my weapon. I pulled up the original schematics for the locket that Richard had stored on our private server. And that's when I found the second fail-safe, the detail that elevated my husband's genius into the realm of the sublime. The Kunoat Trong Kunoat, as he would have called it. The GPS unit was the primary system, yes. But Richard, paranoid and brilliant, knew that any electronic signal could be found and disabled. The true secret of the locket was not electronic. It was mechanical. He had replaced the original, simple clasp with a masterfully crafted, microscopic puzzle lock of his own design. It could be opened with a normal amount of force, yes, but to do so would break a tiny internal filament, a detail no one would ever notice. The only way to open the locket without breaking this filament was to know the secret, a precise sequence of 3 clicks and a twist. And inside the locket, behind the space where a photograph was supposed to be, he had micro-engraved a single, 24-character alphanumeric code. It was the private key to a Swiss bank account. An account, I now realized, that held the patents and intellectual property rights for his most profitable inventions, a portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars. The locket was not just a locket, it was a key to our entire financial legacy. Ashley hadn't just stolen a piece of jewelry. She had, in her ignorance, stolen the master key to an empire and then sold it for what was likely a few $1,000s in cash. The sheer, breathtaking scale of her stupidity was almost beautiful in its perfection. Now, my plan had a new, sharper focus. It was no longer about just recovering a stolen keepsake, it was about protecting a legacy. And it was about making sure that when the trap finally sprung, it would not just embarrass Ashley, it would annihilate her. My third move was a phone call. Not to the police, not yet, but to an old friend, Detective Frank Miller. Frank was a dinosaur, a grizzled old-school cop from the Financial Crimes Division who was just a few months away from a well-earned retirement. He had been one of Richard's oldest friends, a partner from their weekly poker games. He was a man who, like me, understood that justice is a dish best served cold. "Frank," I said, after we had exchanged the usual pleasantries, "I need your help with something, off the record. It involves a stolen piece of jewelry and a very stupid, very greedy young woman." I explained the situation, the locket, the theft, the pawn shop. I did not, however, mention the secret of the patents. That was my ace, to be played only at the very end. Frank listened in silence, the only sound on his end the occasional, weary sigh of a man who has seen the very worst of human nature. "So she just walked out with it?" he finally asked. "She did," I confirmed. "And you have her on your home security cameras?" "High definition, time-stamped, and backed up on 3 separate servers," I replied. Richard was nothing if not thorough. There was a pause. Then, I heard him smile. "Oh, Vivian," he said, his voice full of a dark, appreciative glee. "This is going to be fun. What's the plan?" Together, we orchestrated the final act. It would not be a quiet arrest at her home. That was too simple, too private. The humiliation, I decided, must be as public as her crime was personal. Ashley lived for the validation of her online audience, for the envy of her so-called friends. So, it was in front of them that she would be brought down. Using an anonymous tip provided by a concerned citizen, Frank arranged for a low-level police presence to monitor Honest Abe's pawn shop, citing a recent string of burglaries in the area. This would ensure the locket remained safely in place. Next, I turned my attention to Ashley's social calendar. As I suspected, she was planning a lavish party for the following weekend. An impromptu celebration at the city's most exclusive rooftop restaurant. The theme, according to the digital invitation she had sent out, was celebrating a new chapter. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. This would be our stage. I made one final call to the restaurant's owner, a man who sat on the board of one of my charities. I explained, in vague but compelling terms, that a very important law enforcement event would be taking place during the party and that his full, discreet cooperation would be required. He agreed without question. All the pieces were in place, the bait was taken, the hunter was in position, the trap was set. All that was left was for the prey to walk into it, fat and happy and completely oblivious, blinded by the glitter of her own greed. And I would be there to watch, hidden in plain sight, a quiet old woman in the corner, enjoying the final, beautiful, and devastating click of the lock. The night of Ashley's new chapter party was a spectacle of shallow victories. The rooftop restaurant glittered against the city skyline, a perfect, sparkling stage for her to flaunt her newfound, ill-gotten wealth. She had invited everyone who mattered in her superficial world. Fellow influencers with vacant smiles, minor local celebrities, and a collection of wealthy, bored women whose friendship she so desperately craved. I, of course, was not invited. My presence would have spoiled the narrative she was so carefully crafting. But I was there. I was seated at a quiet, discreet table at the far end of the terrace, partially hidden by a large potted palm, a ghost at her feast. I had arrived an hour early, escorted in through a private service entrance by the restaurant's owner himself, a man whose museum wing my foundation had funded last year. To the rest of the guests, I was just a quiet, elegant old woman enjoying a solitary dinner. No one gave me a second glance. On the table, my phone lay screen down, but it was active, the red dot of the locket's backup beacon pulsing steadily from Ashley's designer handbag, which sat carelessly on the chair beside her. She was holding court, a champagne flute in one hand, her other hand constantly, nervously, touching the cheap, gold-plated replica of my locket that hung around her neck. She was in the middle of a dramatic, heavily embellished story about a surprise inheritance from a distant, eccentric, and fabulously wealthy great-aunt. The lies flowed from her lips as easily and as bubbly as the champagne. I watched her, and I felt a profound, cold pity. She was a child playing dress-up in a world she could never truly understand, a world built on history, loyalty, and secrets she couldn't even fathom. At precisely 9:15 p.m., just as the main courses were being cleared, the first part of the trap was sprung. My old friend, Detective Frank Miller, entered the restaurant. He was not in uniform. He was wearing a simple, well-worn tweed suit, looking less like a cop and more like a tired old history professor who had wandered into the wrong party. He was accompanied by two younger, uniformed officers who remained politely but firmly by the main entrance, their presence an immediate and chilling shift in the party's atmosphere. Frank walked slowly, deliberately, to the center of the terrace. He did not shout or cause a scene. He simply cleared his throat, a low, gravelly sound that nonetheless cut through the self-congratulatory chatter like a razor. "Excuse me, folks," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight that made everyone turn. "Sorry to interrupt your evening. My name is Detective Miller, Financial Crimes Division." A nervous, electric hush fell over the party. Champagne flutes paused mid-air. The carefully curated music seemed to falter. Ashley froze mid-laugh, her eyes darting from Frank to the uniformed officers at the door. I saw the first, genuine flicker of panic bloom in her eyes. "We're here tonight," Frank continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd of suddenly sober faces before landing, with the gentle but inescapable precision of a sniper, on my daughter-in-law. "To investigate the recent theft of a significant, high-value piece of historical jewelry. We have reason to believe it may have passed through the hands of someone at this party." Ashley's face went pale. I watched her hand fly instinctively to her neck, clutching the fake locket. It was a perfect, beautiful, self-incriminating gesture. A confession made in pure, unthinking terror. The piece in question, Frank continued, pulling a printed photograph from his jacket pocket, is an 18th century, French-made, carved gold locket. It was reported stolen from a private residence 2 days ago. He held up the photo. It was a perfect high-definition image of my locket. This piece is not just valuable. It is, for all intents and purposes, priceless. It is a one-of-a-kind historical artifact. He then looked directly at Ashley, his eyes kind but his voice unyielding. "Ma'am," he said, "that is a very interesting necklace you're wearing. It looks remarkably similar to the stolen item. Would you mind if we took a closer look?" The entire party turned to stare at Ashley. The spotlight she had craved all evening was now hers, but it was not the warm glow of admiration. It was the cold, harsh glare of a police interrogation. "This?" she stammered, her voice a high-pitched squeak. "This island. This is just a replica, a piece of costume jewelry." "I'm sure it is," Frank said, his voice still gentle. "But our protocol requires us to verify. If you'll just hand it over, we can confirm it's a replica and be on our way. Unless, of course, you have something to hide?" She was trapped. To refuse was to admit guilt. To hand it over was to be exposed as a liar in front of the very people she was so desperate to impress. Her mind was racing, searching for an escape that didn't exist. With a trembling hand, she unclasped the fake locket and handed it to Frank. He examined it for a moment, then nodded. "You're right," he said, and I could see the wave of relief wash over Ashley's face. "This is indeed a cheap replica." He then turned back to her, his expression still kindly, but his next question was the killing blow. "But that leads me to a more interesting question. Why, ma'am, would you be wearing a cheap replica of a priceless, one-of-a-kind artifact that was stolen just 2 days ago, and which no one outside the owner's immediate family even knew existed?" The trap had closed. The logic was inescapable. The entire terrace was silent, every guest now a juror in the court of Ashley's public humiliation. Her face crumpled. The game was up. Ashley stood there, exposed under the glittering party lights, the silence of her peers, a far more damning verdict than any judge's gavel. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The web of lies she had so carefully spun had just been incinerated by a single, logical question. "Two," she stammered, looking desperately towards my son, Robert, who stood frozen a few feet away, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. He had been a silent accomplice to the theft, and he was now a silent witness to its disastrous conclusion. It was at that moment that I decided the final act of this little drama needed its director to take the stage. I stood up from my table in the corner and began to walk slowly, deliberately, across the terrace. With every step I took, the crowd of guests parted before me, their whispers following me like a wake. I stopped beside Detective Miller. "Frank," I said, my voice clear and calm, "thank you for your help. I believe I can handle it from here." Frank gave me a small, respectful nod and stepped back, ceding the floor to me. I turned to my daughter-in-law. Ashley stared at me, her eyes wide with a terror that was now mixed with a profound, soul-shattering confusion. "Vivian," she whispered. "What? What are you doing here?" "I was enjoying a quiet dinner, my dear," I replied, my voice gentle, "until my property became the subject of a police investigation." I then looked at the cheap replica still in Frank's hand. "And I must say, Ashley, I'm a little disappointed. If you're going to replace a priceless artifact, at least have the decency to find a better quality fake." A few nervous titters went through the crowd. My calm, almost amused demeanor was the final, surreal touch on an already unbelievable scene. "But how did you know?" she asked, the question a desperate plea for understanding. I simply pulled out my own phone, unlocked the screen, and showed it to her. On the screen was the satellite map, with the strong, steady red dot pulsing from inside a building just a few blocks away. "Honest Abe's Pawn and Loan," I said quietly. "Richard always did love technology. He called this his fail-safe." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in her mind. The look on her face was not one of remorse. It was the look of pure, unadulterated fury of a cheater who has been outplayed. "But that's not all," I continued. my voice hardening for the first time. I turned to Detective Miller. Frank, the item my daughter-in-law pawned was not just a piece of jewelry. As I explained to you, the locket itself is a key. Frank nodded grimly. We have already been in contact with the bank, ma'am. A key? Ashley asked, her voice a hollow echo. Yes, dear, I said, turning my cold, final gaze upon her. A key to a Swiss bank vault containing the patents and intellectual property for your late father-in-law's greatest inventions. A portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars. I let that sink in. You didn't just pawn a locket, Ashley. You attempted to sell the master key to an empire you had no right to. That elevates this from simple theft to a matter of industrial espionage. The federal authorities will be very interested in that. That was the word that finally broke her. Federal. She stumbled backwards, her hand flying to her mouth, the full catastrophic weight of her actions finally crashing down upon her. She had not just committed a petty, spiteful crime. She had committed a life-altering, career-ending, freedom-threatening felony. The two uniformed officers, on a silent cue from Frank, began to walk towards her. Her friends, the ones she had been so desperate to impress, began to back away, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination, eager to distance themselves from the unfolding disaster. Robert, she cried, turning to my son, her last, desperate hope. Do something. My son, Robert, looked at his sobbing, hysterical wife. He looked at the approaching officers, and then he looked at me, his mother, standing there calm, powerful, and in complete control. I simply met his gaze, my expression unreadable. I did not offer him a lifeline. I did not offer him forgiveness. I simply offered him a choice, and for the first time in years, he made the right one. He slowly, deliberately, shook his head. That was the moment she truly broke. The uniformed officers reached her, and she didn't fight. She just crumpled, a beautiful, expensive doll whose strings had been cut. As they escorted a now sobbing Ashley from the terrace, past the stunned, silent guests, Frank walked over to me. He handed me the cheap replica. I believe this is yours, he said, a wry smile on his face. I took it and, without a second glance, dropped it into a nearby trash can. I have no need for imitations, Frank, I said. I have the real thing. He nodded. We'll recover the original from the pawn shop in the morning. It's evidence now. He paused. Richard would have been proud, Vivian. He always said you were the smartest person he ever knew. After the police had left and the shocked guests had begun to disperse, I stood alone on the terrace, the city lights twinkling below me. My son approached me hesitantly. Mom, he began, his voice thick with a shame so profound it was almost a physical presence. I am so sorry. I looked at him, at the wreckage of the life he had chosen. I know, Robert, I said, my voice soft again. And that is the real tragedy. You will be. I left him there and walked away. The locket was safe, the legacy was secure. But my heart ached, because in the end, I had not just exposed a thief, I had lost a son. Some victories, I realized, feel an awful lot like loss. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your own story in the comments. Your voice, believe me, always matters.